Hello and welcome to my presentation on the double victimization of criminalized women in neoliberal context, the case of Paraguay. My name is Jacob Tavolieri-Essex and I'm one of the young researchers at the University of Windsor. In today's presentation, we'll start off by me giving a brief introduction on our research and everything we'll be talking about. We'll then move into the existing literature on neoliberalism and precarious women, double victimization of marginalized neoliberalism in the case of Paraguay. From there, I'll move on to the research questions, the methods used, and the data collected. Lastly, to finish off the presentation, I'll go through our findings and then end with a brief conclusion. I hope you find the presentation informative and useful. Now let's get started. A characteristic of neoliberal governmentality is the feminization of criminality and with it the demonstrable reality of state violence against marginalized women. We used the case of Paraguay considering the realities of its post-dictatorship in order to build the hypothesis. We look into the relationship between neoliberal ideologies, impoverishment, criminalization, and the incarceration of women in Paraguay. With the nation moving further away from dictatorship, incarceration has risen from 60 prisoners per 100,000 Paraguayans in 2000 to 199 prisoners. No population has this trend been more noticeable than for women. While exploring the ways that women in this new democratic nation become victimized by state violence of incarceration, as well as being singled out for additional violence while incarcerated. Also, based on reporting physical and emotional victimization by prison officials during women's custodial periods, the research engages quantitatively and quantitatively with the question, are women rendered vulnerable by neoliberal policies more likely to be victimized by state agents when under their control? This is investigated through the rubric of double victimization that neoliberal systems incentivize the incarceration of the precarious and then enact violence against their incarcerated bodies. To understand what the existing literature entails, we must go through each aspect individually. First, starting with neoliberalism in the precarious woman. The transition to neoliberal governance models impact all citizens, but there are, however, particular challenges with being a woman in this new state paradigm. Notably, the increasing reliance on unpaid, gendered labor in the neoliberal states ensures women work harder towards tasks that are not even given a market value, in turn devaluing them. Also, the consequences of neoliberal deregulation for the gender age gap, family and maternity leave, and other traditional gendered social policy issues. The welfare state was premised upon specific patriarchal premises that the neoliberal state has questioned and sought to restore. More than enough literature elaborates on patriarchal forms that welfare states assumes moral stewardship over women's bodies, creating women as inherently subordinate to men in their citizenship and limiting their public roles to the private, domestic sphere. The neoliberal state has espoused a narrative gender equality, thus exposing women to the free market. In neoliberal governmentalities, a cycle of vulnerability and marginalization may be theorized. Bodies are victimized depending on the extent to which they are functionally excluded from the state. This exclusion is classified, racialized, and gendered. The most vulnerable members of the shrinking neoliberal state are exposed to victimization. In this respect, neoliberalism may be dangerous for girls and women. Neoliberal policies fall disproportionately on women because of their disproportionate precariousness. The status of a person in a market economy proceeds from which women are impoverished, once subject to exploitation on the open market. Feminization of poverty may be considered a characteristic of neoliberal systems. In Latin America, both the realities of the feminization of poverty and their overrepresentation among the lowest ranks of criminal enterprises is documented. Similarly, the growth of female incarcerated population in Latin America has grown over the last 20 years. Now, we look into the double victimization of marginalized in neoliberalism. Many scholars have noted the seeming ubiquity of mass incarceration in neoliberal systems. The existing paradigms of impoverishment and criminalization in neoliberalism suggest the existence of a path of double victimization through which the state creates a set of offenders and victims and then punishes the group members for their status. A singular conception positions double victimization as the rough, onerous, and often insulting treatment of victims at the hands of law enforcement. However, this research builds upon a third line of reasoning, that vulnerable people are rendered victims through inaction by the state and that their victim status is then criminalized. For women in neoliberal governmentalities, double victimization means that women are already rendered vulnerable through social policies that work to build undereducation, illiteracy, discrimination based on maternal status, poverty, and housing insecurity are then criminalized by the state that are rendered them vulnerable. This article focuses on an analysis of a particular set of criminalized women in neoliberal regimes, women incarcerated in the Latin American country of Paraguay. Understanding the mechanisms through which women find themselves pursued, arrested, and sentenced in a context with no present-day or historical welfare state allows a clean proxy of neoliberal dynamics, vice versa the female body. This means that Paraguay presents a clear instance of paradigmatic neoliberalism with comprehensive and accurate data of female incarceration and equally reliable informed information on the lived realities of their sentences. The last piece of existing literature is on the case of Paraguay. Women's prisons in Paraguay are not necessarily women's prisons. Rather, they're male-dominant prisons with women's areas. These are characterized by overcrowding, a complete lack of privacy, no clothing provision, and ubiquitous corruption. Incarcerated women, as well as men, are in prisons without any guarantee of food, access to water, health, education, work, or recreation. Recently, a research study indicated that even in the sole woman prison in the nation's situations, prison officials sexually harass and beat women inmates. This research seeks to illuminate the ways in which these realities are not exceptional, but rather characteristic of the incarceration of vulnerable citizens in a paradigmatic neoliberal state. Are women incarcerated in Paraguay disproportionately already victimized by neoliberal state violence? Here, understood to be undereducation and illiteracy, discrimination based on maternal status, poverty, housing insecurity, then criminalized by the state that rendered them vulnerable? Do victimized women incarcerated in neoliberal Paraguay suffer from more state violence in Paraguayan prisons? Given the existing literature regarding the vulnerability of women in neoliberal contexts, results will work to investigate whether it is more vulnerable and marginalized women who are victims of the state in neoliberal Paraguay. The research done employs a mixed methodology approach to addressing the research question, integrating the analysis of a large survey that represents 96.5% of the full population of incarcerated women in Paraguay. We also present findings from extended interviews with 11 inmates who exemplify the population of interest for this research. In order to best investigate the research question, we present variables related to the axis of oppression identified in the existing literature: undereducation and illiteracy, maternal status, poverty, and housing insecurity. Our quantitative data: there are 18 prisons in the nation of Paraguay, totaling a population of 12,741 inmates at the end of 2015. Two prisons, La Casa del Buen Pastor, also known as the House of the Good Shepherd, and Juana Maria de Lero, are women's prisons. Two prisons have wings devoted exclusively to women, while 5 prisons contain women in segregated units. In total, as of December 2015, when consensus surveys were administered, there were 813 female prisoners dispersed across these 9 institutions. After explaining the objectives and the scope of the project each of one of the women, 28, or 3.5%, decided to abstain from participation. Analysis thus includes 96.5% of the women incarcerated population of the country, for a total number of 785 incarcerated women. Our qualitative data: semi-structured interviews were conducted by representatives of the Mecanismo with incarcerated women at La Casa del Buen Pastor Penitentiary, located in the capital of Paraguay, where more than half of the total numbers of incarcerated women in the country are imprisoned. Inmates were invited to voluntarily participate in the research, which were audio recorded with participants' permission. To facilitate interviews, a guide with 8 main axes was employed. These included socio-demographic data, questions regarding educational background and family history, economic and occupational position, criminal history, incarceration experiences, and experiences with violence. Interviews also asked respondents to reflect on their plans for post-incarceration. Responses allowed the research to triangulate and contextualize quantitative findings. Our findings. Our findings under education and literacy are, of the women surveyed, 652 or 83% reported being numerate, while 659 or 84% were literate. This suggests female prisoners had fewer basic scholastic skills than Paraguayan women overall, almost 99% of whom are illiterate. Undereducation in female prisons is also rampant, with approximately 27% of respondents having not completed primary school. Poverty. Women incarcerated in Paraguay were overwhelmingly more likely to be poor than most Paraguayans. Nearly 14% reported being unemployed at the time of their incarceration. National unemployment rates varied between 5% and 9% in the years from 2010 through 2017. Of these who employed, mean weekly earnings were 149 Paraguayan dollars, which is approximately 61.23 in US dollars. These mean wages were 20% lower than the national legal minimum wage. Only 24% of these respondents reported incomes that exceeded this figure. Housing insecurity. Of the inmates, 5.5% had lived in a shelter at some point before their incarceration. Just over 12% had spent some part of their childhood engaged in domestic labor in the home of a non-family member. Childhood shelter was dependent on the uncompensation completion of domestic service. One former inmate described her experience of doing unpaid and coerced housework under a scheme of exploitation and mistreatment during her childhood. Slide 8. The conclusion. Capitalism has become a powerful agent in the relative liberation of those women positioned as a function of class, race, nativity to participation fully in economic and labor markets. For those women who are vulnerable as a function of inclusion on the various axes of oppression, however, neoliberalism has introduced a degree of penalty to the lived experience that is unique historically. This article explores the dynamics of double victimization, incarceration, and state violence in Paraguay. Although poor and precarious women have become more reliant on their market position to ensure their survival, neoliberal policies have not worked to better their collective position in labor markets, nor have they increased wages in low-skilled positions. This has pushed women increasingly into illegal labor markets, especially in the drug trade and sex work. The neoliberal state has, however, vastly increased the punishments associated with this kind of labor, meaning that poor women have concurrently become more exposed to risk from their positions both within and outside of the state. The findings of this research present a compelling confirmation of existing theory. The violence of neoliberalism against the vulnerable to present in terms of undereducation and illiteracy, maternal status, poverty, housing insecurity, are quantitative and qualitative data suggest the vulnerable suffer in neoliberal regimes. Posing women's incarceration to be a mechanism through this violence is exerted, we find the female prisoners are indeed likely to be undereducated, mothers, poor, and housing insecure. We also find that these are the prisoners who endure the most physical and emotional abuse at the hands of carceral agents, in line with the exempt theory. We make an empirical argument that the feminization of criminality, and with it the demonstrable reality of state violence against marginalized women, is a characteristic of neoliberal governmentality. We present a case of paradigmatic neoliberalism, Paraguay, in which marginalized women, oppressed as much as a function of theorized axes of oppression, were both overrepresented in penal population and explicitly made victims of state violence during periods of incarceration. In this neoliberal context, we see women alienated from the state in a pattern of victimization and double victimization.